Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more of the Great War. This time, week 144. I've watched so much of this. Oh my god. But we're too far in to stop. The Battle of Doiran. Turmoil in the French army. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you check out. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. Okay. Really have nothing else to add there because, the Kickstarter is over. By now it should be. If I'm remembering days right and doing math in my head correctly. Anyways, I believe, are the French mutinies about to start, or do we have like another week or two before they really start? I don't know. Let's dive in.
Over the past few weeks, we've seen smaller nations fighting exceptionally well, like Canada and Australia. And this week is another good week for often overlooked countries from the war. This week, Bulgaria holds the line.
Woo!
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Nivelle offensive under French commander Robert Nivelle began, and it proved to be a complete disaster for the French, who suffered nearly 100,000 casualties in just 5 days. The British finished their own battle to the north, while other British were busy losing the Second Battle of Gaza to the Ottomans on the Palestine front. One front we haven't heard much from so far this year is the Macedonian front, but it flared to life this week. Both the British and the Bulgarians had beefed up their armies in the region over the past couple of months. The British now had over 40,000 men there, and the Bulgarian 9th Plaven Division under Vladimir Vazov had 30,000, behind a formidable system of defense, as we saw in early February. New action began with a days-long British artillery barrage of over 100,000 shells. The Bulgarian artillery responded with a fierce, hour-long counter-barrage of over 10,000 shells. The British infantry then assaulted the Bulgarian positions. The plan...
Well, actually, not in the context of this war, not a lot of shells, right? 10,000? That's weak sauce compared to the Western Front.
...was to drive the Bulgarians out of their first trench lines, bring up the artillery, and force them back to the second. Twice the British reached the Bulgarian trenches, and twice they were beaten back. One place where they made their advance was Jumo Ravine, but here they were fired on by German naval guns being used on land, and the force of the explosions would kill the men by slamming them against the rock walls of the ravine. But by dawn on the 25th, some British units had succeeded in taking the first Bulgarian trench lines and held them against 4 counterattacks. Thing is, a French attack near Monastir was supposed to take place at the same time to tie down the enemy, but bad weather postponed it. And on the evening of the 26th, at Jumo Ridge, when the attack was resumed, a British brigade went forward too soon, and over 5,000 of the men were killed or wounded by their own artillery.
Ooh.
By the 27th, the British had been forced to withdraw to their original positions, and the battle was suspended. The British were also attacking on the Western Front as well this week. They were still expected to keep up pressure on the Germans at Arras, so the French would be able to succeed further south on the Aisne. So, with barely any planning, the Second Battle of the Scarpe began on a 14-kilometer front on April 23rd. Compared to the events of the 9th, it was way under-resourced, but it also faced a new hurdle. The Germans had learned some lessons, like if they were only playing defense, they could place their artillery far to the rear. That way it could still fire on no man's land, but would be out of range of the British artillery. The Germans had also brought up fresh divisions. The fighting was bitter, and the British made a very painful sacrifice, diverting German troops from their allies. The fighting most often degenerated into small engagements, actually, even at platoon and company levels. And though the British made some progress, it was slow, and it came at great cost. But British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig believed that the Germans were weakening and that constant pressure...
He still believes that? Haig, haven't you learned your lesson? I thought, like last week, didn't he had a moment of common sense where he was like, let's be, right? He was like patient or something. Was that what it was? Or can't remember what it was. I think it was, no, it was him being cautious. He was cautious like last week or something. Haig, what the fuck happened, dude?
...would break them. Haig most often believed this, as we saw at the Somme last year. The German defenses were no longer the classic thick front line and open rear style, but were flexible and deep, and penetration simply meant being surrounded. As the British advanced into well-fortified villages or bunkers far behind the original lines, German resistance actually increased, just as British supply problems grew. So by the end of this week, the optimistic first day of the Battle of Arras, a mere 2 weeks ago, was largely forgotten, for British casualties were over 100,000 since then, and there was no sign of a breakthrough. The generals began preparing for another offensive to take place on May 3rd. And what of the French offensive? Well, it had been halted for the time being on the 20th, but the French command had fresh worries. On the 21st, African troops of the elite units that often led General Charles Mangin's armies began shouting, "Peace! Down with war! Death to those responsible!"
Let's fucking
Other
go.
French units were getting drunk by the thousands and refusing to go to the front. On the 25th, French President Raymond Poincaré ordered Nivelle to officially end the attack. Nivelle then blamed Mangin for the failures and dismissed him from command of the 6th Army. He tried to blame General Joseph Michelet as well. Michelet had opposed the offensive from the very start, to the point of insubordination, writing Nivelle letters saying it's a bad idea, and even going so far as telling the French president and the prime minister his fears of disaster. It was Michelet who commanded the reserves who were to be ready to exploit a breakthrough, and he who now responded to Nivelle with contempt. What? You try to make me responsible for the mistake when I never cease to warn you. Do you know what such an action is called? It is called cowardice. The battle wasn't actually entirely over, as we'll see in fits and starts over the next month. But by the end, France would take between 180 and 270,000 casualties, depending on which source you believe. German casualties are estimated at 163,000. Neither side could afford this kind of loss at this point. Nivelle was destroyed, not really so much by failure, but because he had promised so much. And the week ends with his career in jeopardy. And as a side note here, in the middle of this disaster were actually Russian soldiers from the Russian Expeditionary Force. They reflected an accurate, or possibly exaggerated, version of their army back home, electing soldiers' councils, which the officers were unable to prevent. This revolutionary atmosphere could not help but affect the French troops that fought beside them. It was actually worse back home in Russia. British military attaché Colonel Knox was told by Russian Assistant Minister of War Colonel Yakubovich that of 1,000 men-strong drafts, only a couple of hundred men would reach the front. Technicians were being expelled from munitions factories. On the 23rd, the Bolshevik Party's newspaper Pravda asked the Russian soldiers, "Are you willing to fight for this, that the English capitalists should rob Mesopotamia and Palestine?" To compound worries for the future, Vladimir Lenin had arrived in Russia last week to a chaotic post-February Revolution society. The provisional government, which had been officially recognized by the Allies, although in reality it vied for power with the Petrograd Soviet, was increasingly unable to keep the armies intact or the home front under control, despite big financing from Britain and France. German Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, hoping for more popular dissent in Russia, had approved Lenin's journey from exile in Switzerland through Frankfurt, Berlin, Stockholm, and Helsinki to Petrograd. When he arrived, he began organizing his supporters into an anti-war stance that would tap into the public discontent. The Russian army had promised a May 1st attack to support the Nivelle offensive and had put together a massive force for it. But by now, it was obvious that it was impossible to carry out. Not only because a lot of the troops were uncontrollable, but there wasn't even enough coal to run the necessary trains. And as if there weren't already headaches enough for the provisional government, on the 24th, Ukraine demanded autonomy. And at the end of the week, Lenin took the chair at the Petrograd Bolshevik Conference. But far to the south, other attacks were taking place that were putting the Allies in a better position. Since taking Baghdad in mid-March, the British had been advancing up the Tigris River and the Samara offensive. Its objectives included taking the rail yard at Samara to prevent the Ottomans from building up or linking up their troops, and the securing of the dams around Baghdad to prevent the enemy from flooding them out. Final success was achieved this week. The British were victorious in the Battle of Istabulat the 21st and 22nd, and the Ottomans surrendered the rail yard and nearly 1,000 prisoners the 24th. This pretty much ended any Ottoman hopes of regaining a strategic stronghold in the region. But the British paid a lot for the victory. They had lost around 18,000 men in the offensive and a further 38,000 to illness. And that was the week.
I mean, it's not as, casualties aren't as bad as the Western Front. That's something, right?
Rumblings of discontent in France and Russia, and the British losing in the Balkans and winning in the Middle East. Just look at all that happened this week, and you can see that this war is really degenerating into chaos, often bloody chaos.
It wasn't already there.
What are they doing? The British and French have just lost hundreds of thousands of men in what can kindly be described as really stupid offensives. So by now, the French troops don't even want to fight. The British were humiliated last week at Gaza, and though they won this week on the Tigris, that whole mission was originally just to secure the oil fields. Now they're deep in hostile territory with crappy supply lines, losing tens of thousands of men to illness for what? In Russia, there are so many agendas being pursued that God alone knows what's going on. In the Balkans, the Allies are doing what? What? Absolutely nothing in this war.
I love it when Indy's frustration just cannot be bottled up anymore. And every few weeks or so, couple months, he goes off like this because he's just so frustrated with it. I love it.
War makes any sense anymore, and nobody at all seems to know what they're doing. If you want to know more about someone not knowing what they're doing, you can click here for our bio special about Konrad von Hotzendorf.
That was a good transition. I like that. Any opportunity to make fun of Hotzendorf or Luigi Cadorna, I will take. That was the Battle of Doiran, Turmoil in the French Army, the Great War, week 144. I have nothing to add here at the end. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.